If you are struggling with your gut health, whether it's IBS, SIBO, IBD, you may want to think about it as a journey from the top down through all of your different microbiomes. If we look to microbiome research, we can clearly see that dysbiosis occurs on many levels and in many different locations. So there's dysbiosis of the sinus microbiome, the oral cavity, the respiratory tract, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the small intestine, the colon, the urinary tract, and so on. And dysbiosis in one location can very much be linked to dysbiosis in another location, such as the gut. Hi, my name is Christina Mitz. I am a functional nutritionist specializing in microbiome restoration. Let's get into it. Let's talk about the different microbiomes and the role that they play in different health conditions and different symptoms. Starting with the sinus microbiome. So often overlooked and forgotten about, the sinus microbiome can influence respiratory health and systemic inflammation. So the sinus microbiome has been found to be dysbiotic in allergic conditions as well as those who struggle with chronic respiratory infections. However, it may be linked to other health conditions, especially chronic inflammation-related health conditions, because of the way that it impacts our inflammatory cytokines. So, dysbiosis in the sinus microbiome seems to trigger an increase in more allergic type cytokines, such as IL-6, IL-4, IL-33. And these are cytokines that I often speak to when I'm talking to people about food sensitivities and different ways of calming down food sensitivity and allergic type reactions. What we know for certain is that dysbiosis of the sinus microbiome might contribute to chronic sinusitis, so symptoms of brain fog, feeling of pressure in the face, pressure in the sinus cavity, respiratory related symptoms. You are more likely to require an assessment of the sinus microbiome if you have a history of sinus infections, sinus surgeries, or a history of mold exposure. Next up is the oral microbiome. So the oral cavity is the gateway to the digestive system. If things are off in the oral cavity, you can actually see leaking of oral cavity microbes into the gut. And this is something that certain testing will actually pick up. So when I'm looking at certain types of stool testing, I'm actually looking for microbes that have leaked from the oral cavity down to the colonic microbiome and are now showing up in stool PCR. You may not even have symptoms that you're aware of, but you're more likely to require an assessment that considers this if you have periodontal disease, bleeding gums, if you have or think that you have cavities, if you have root canals, or if you have a history of cavitations. Next up is the stomach microbiome. Now, the stomach usually keeps itself healthy by producing stomach acid during mealtime. However, this can be disrupted, especially in those who have a history of use of PPIs, antacids, or a history of H. pylori. It may also be disrupted if you are experiencing a lot of physical or emotional stress, or if you have a thyroid condition. If you struggle with low B12, with different types of anemia, low iron, if you're just not absorbing your nutrients, it is definitely worth it to look into issues with the stomach microbiome, as well as considering acidity. Next up are the gallbladder and the pancreas microbiomes. You can actually have dysbiosis within the biliary ducts and biliary system, as well as the pancreatic ducts. H. pylori and parasitic infections are particularly big influencers of the gallbladder biliary ducts, but then you also want to consider how your bile is being produced and the quality of your bile. Research into the pancreatic microbiome is still new, but there is a particularly large focus on the pancreatic microbiome and its relationship with pancreatic cancer, as well as its ability to influence the success of treatment for pancreatic cancer. Next up is the small intestinal microbiome. So this is obviously relevant if you are struggling with leaky gut, with food sensitivities and intolerances, if you are struggling with bloating, constipation, diarrhea, or alternating constipation and diarrhea. The easiest method for assessment is a breath test. However, there are a few doctors who do different types of biopsy into the small intestine. Only a few who do it correctly, though. So this would be Dr. Rao and then also Dr. Pimentel. Next up is the colon microbiome. So we can run PCR stool testing, which is going to be quite effective and accurate when it comes to testing what's going on in the colonic microbiome. This is of course relevant for those who are dealing with symptoms of IBS, such as bloating, constipation, diarrhea, etc., and for those with IBD as well. Last but not least is the urinary microbiome. So this is relevant for those with interstitial cystitis, chronic UTIs, chronic yeast infections. If you have symptoms of UTI or cystitis, but you keep turning up a negative test, at least with the test that your doctor is running, definitely worth it to consider biofilm. The research very clearly demonstrates that if someone is producing a negative test but still has symptoms of cystitis or UTI, definitely there are microbes that are remaining within the urinary tract that have likely produced biofilm. And this can be connected to the other microbiomes as well. So often working on the small and the large intestinal microbiome is worth your while, as well as reducing systemic biofilm. To recap the types of tests that we're thinking about, so stool testing, so PCR for the colonic microbiome, which will also pick up leaked microbes from the oral and the other microbiomes, breath testing for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or small intestinal methane overgrowth, and then sinus and oral swabs for the sinus microbiome and the oral microbiome. Treatment for sinus dysbiosis can look like different types of nasal sprays, ranging from like EDTA or BEG nasal sprays, cromolyn nasal sprays, xylitol nasal sprays, herbal nasal sprays, and peptide nasal sprays, biofilm disrupting nasal sprays. Treatment for oral dysbiosis typically looks like more frequent visits to the dentist, depending on what you're going through. It could look like better oral care, frequent mouth washing, oil pulling, etc. We might use targeted probiotics or prebiotics. There are probiotics for each of the aforementioned microbiomes. Antimicrobials, herbs, peptides, and general microbiome restoration. That pretty well covers the top-down journey through the different microbiomes in the body as it pertains to gut health, bloating, brain fog, etc. If you have any questions, I would love to see them in the comments below.